Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is this thing on? Everyone here okay? Anyone you can't hear, raise your hand. No.
You may speak closely into the mic.
Okay,
yeah.
to make it up the stream.
Yeah.
Alright. First thing I need to do is apologise. I've got a bit of a stinker of a chest infection, so I may need to stop occasionally to cough up a lung. But we'll keep going. So, I work for Red Hat. I work on their mobile team. And so, we have a mobile application platform that is Node-based. So we do a lot of things with mobile, we do a lot of things with Node, which is probably why I'm invited along here today to speak. And so really, it's just a little thing on mobile and some of the challenges and some of the solutions that we can have and stuff. And so really it's a case of going mobile, do I need to bother? And the simple thing is, no, not really. It's a little more nuanced than that, but the big problem we have with mobile is trying to define exactly what mobile is. You know, it's not as simple as it's your phone, because you've got phones, you've got tablets, you've got people that wrap Mac Pros and bring them around on flight cases and are they mobile as well. And even among the devices, you know, you have this whole idea of small screens. There's a little sample of some of the screen sizes from some of the most popular devices. You know, ranging from iPads up to your iPad Pros. You've got your iPhones, your various sized iPhones, all that kind of thing. You know, it's a big problem. We can't just think that it's a small screen. You know, we've got ones that are full 720, we've got ones that are full HD. Slow connections. Well, yeah, maybe we look at mobile and say, is it just a slow connection that we need to deal with? 62% of mobile connections are on 2G. So yes, clearly that matters. But then there's 38% that aren't. And so you've got that whole thing as well. So, you know, it gets very confusing when we try and specifically go down the route of what mobile is. Do we talk about performance? Again, we've got massive differences in performance between mobile devices. You've got your iPhone 6Ss and 6S Pluses and all of those 6 Plus S's and all those. You've got your Android phones. There's huge chasms of performance between them. So Jeff Atwood, Coding Horror, did a very good piece last year in September, and he was doing some performance testing on a whole range of devices. And basically, in a nutshell, fastest known Android device available today, so this is September 2015, it's a little time ago, but roughly 5 times slower than a new iPhone 6S. So again, we can't even, you know, take an Android phone and say, that's the performance we're going to go with, or an iPhone is that's the performance we're going to go with. We've got this huge range. So it gets really confusing when we're talking about developing for mobile. Are we talking about apps? Are we talking about websites? Are we talking native? Whatever. There's been some very good solutions to some of these problems that are already out there. And I'm sure a lot of people have heard all about some of them. One of my favourite is Henrik Juretag, who's doing talks at the moment about pocket-sized JS, which is about rapidly minifying the size of things like the JavaScript frameworks that we use client-side. He's using the Google example of Google Plus, that is still around, that have got it down to 60k worth of JavaScript. And, you know, massively minifying these frameworks that everyone has gotten used to. You know, we're all building things in Angular, we're building things in Backbone, we're building things in all these frameworks. But maybe we need to simplify these things down. So there's a good slide deck there, and you can find this talk online, and that's very well worth looking at and very well worth listening to. We've got other things like progressive enhancement. So again, you know, going back to the problems that we have with the multiple screen sizes, we can progressively enhance our experience, and so we can have breakpoints, we can design for different size screens, we can design gracefully designs and apps and client-side apps for mobile that run the full range from the smallest to the largest and that kind of thing. We've got graceful degradation. So again, this is helping to deal with some of the performance issues. You know, so it's the idea of having fallbacks. So serving up full HTML at times, or serving up full apps and then falling back to stuff if we need to. So these are all kind of more web dev sides of things. But to be honest, what we find when we're dealing with enterprises is a lot of their needs can be solved by websites. Everyone wants a mobile app because they're cool, they're sexy, and they're new. But a lot of the time they're not actually strictly necessary. for a lot of use cases, and particularly in the enterprise, because that's where we are mostly. But for an awful lot of use cases, a good website will serve you better than an app. You know, you look at things like the Facebook website on a mobile, that's every bit as good as the app. A lot more people are using that these days. Twitter is a slightly different story, but they've got their own problems. Maybe their new head of engineering will solve some of that issue and stuff, and they'll get better on mobile. But again, you know, these are the kind of things that can be served on mobile, and particularly with the likes of things like service workers and that kind of tech that's coming in, it makes it a lot more viable to have a more app-like experience. And so maybe we'll see a shift away from apps and installable apps to things that are more flexible and stuff. Again, what will the next big thing be? You know, we've got pocket-sized JS, we've got progressive enhancement, there'll be something next. There's always something else along. And so really the core of what I'm proposing today, what I'm talking about today, is can the server be more supportive of this stuff? So again, I'm talking a lot about client-side things there, and your eyes are probably slightly glazing over and going, this is Node. It's not HTML, it's not CSS talk, but why are we talking about all this kind of stuff? And so the idea is, well, can the server be more supportive to those myriad architectures and ways of doing front-end and doing client-side? Can we learn some of the things from some of the client-side technologies and some of the client-side ideas and go, yeah, well actually, do you know what? The way they're approaching things, that makes sense for us as well. Because a lot of the time on the server side, we tend to get very caught up in only providing one source of information, and that's it. We have our API. There you go. Do whatever you want with it, but that's the API. We tend to be quite rigid. So that's why I want to pull in the idea of progressive APIs. And why can't our APIs be more progressive? And why can't we have the idea that our server side can be flexible alongside our client side? So we can be flexible, particularly with Node. It's really easy to be flexible. We don't have to just serve JSON. That's very nice, and there's absolutely use cases for it. And I'm not saying that we don't build APIs that just serve JSON, but it doesn't have to just be that. There are other things that we can serve down. We can serve partials. So ready formatted snippets of HTML, we can send those down as well. So instead of sending down a blob of JSON that describes a user or a piece of information, we can send the already formatted HTML down. Clients will love that because mobile phones are really good at rendering the DOM. In spite of some of the other stories that have been around about performance in the browser and not being good enough and all of that kind of stuff, there are things the browser is still really good at. And rendering to the DOM is one of them. So why not send down ready formatted snippets of HTML? If we use Node, we can use the same templates that we might use on the client. So if we're building an app using Backbone or whatever, and we're using underscore templates, we can use underscore templates in our server side. So we can use the same templates on both sides and render or serve up to the client whatever it is that the client decides is the best thing for the client to have. And with our build tools and stuff, we can share a lot of the code between it and keep it simple. And keeping it simple is the main thing, I think. This is always where it gets a little bit risky, because as engineers, I'm sure you're all much like me, it's all about how complex can we get things and how fancy can we be, and you know, let's do every little thing we can to tweak this, every little bit of performance out of it. And we love being wowed by fancy demos of, you know, look at Google running its searches on 17 Raspberry Pis and, you know, getting multi-core performance out of it and all that kind of stuff. But sometimes I think what we need to do is say, let's go back to the more simpler times. Let's go back to some of the more basic stuff. Because it works, and it works very, very well. And it enables us to get stuff up and running really, really quickly. And for most of the use cases that, again, that we come across day after day, we probably can keep it simple, and there's no need to go too complex. You can add complexity if you want. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. Keep it modular. Again, you know, everyone's big on buzzwords with programming theory and all that kind of stuff. I like modules. I really like modules. Keep everything separate, everything in its own little module, and it makes it really easy to add and take away and test and keep things all nice and neat, and so that you can add in your progressiveness to your APIs and all that kind of thing. So it's easy enough talking about this stuff. Little code samples, little examples of it. So why don't we start small? Why don't we start with a little module, something really simple, that essentially is just like a dummy, some dummy database calls. I have the code for this up on GitHub, and I will share a link around to that at the end. It's doing some stuff with Magic the Gathering cards, because, you know, we're all nerds. Woo! But so just some simple functions here, just to pull, you know, to add cards, get cards, delete cards, all that kind of stuff. So we've got something, a nice simple bog standard module there. I've added in some events so that it emits events, because that could be useful later on. But by and large, it's just nice and simple. So where do we take it from there? Well, why don't we add a JSON API to the front end of that? Make it nice and simple. If somebody is writing a Magic the Gathering app and they want to consume our API, let's give them a JSON API to do it. So again, if we use Express, we can throw together a nice simple module, a nice quick module, and we can put up a very good little JSON API there, and we can serve them whatever information they want. And they get their cards, and they're happy, and that's fine. But then somebody comes along and goes, well, I've got a Windows phone. The poor guy, single guy that has a Windows phone in the corner. And we go, oh, we don't know how to develop for Windows. It's got to get to C# and weirdness, and it's all strange. And so someone goes, well, why not do something that is more of a web app? There is one around that some of you may have seen, which is a Pokedex example that was doing around on Twitter a while ago. I haven't actually included it in this talk, and I really should have. But basically it was a good demo of service workers and offline first. And some guy put together a deck of all the Pokemon cards. Because again, you know, collectible card games is a great data set to do stuff with. But on an Android phone and on Chrome it works offline. It stores stuff on local storage. It's a really impressive demo. It's well worth checking out. But anyway, so let's add partial support to this, because our Windows developer or our Android developer or our iOS developers decide they want to do a website as well, because not everyone downloads apps. So again, we can very quickly throw in an underscore template, and we can render stuff using underscore. And again, we're keeping things really simple, and these are just little separate modules that we can plug in, and we can test, and we can add, and we can remove them, and we can do it all very, very simply. And with our routing, we can decide whether we're serving up partials, whether we're serving up our JSON API, whatever it is that we're doing, whatever it is that we're giving to people. Why not add web tokens? Because of course, authorization, authentication, that's always the big thing. We want some of this to be private maybe. Again, there's nothing that stops us adding a little module that just adds in a JSON web token and parses it. Web tokens are fucking awesome. Excuse my swearing. I've become a big fan of them in the last little while, and I just think they're incredibly useful, particularly when we're building APIs, because you know we can have tokens that are signed with shared keys, and so if we start to get into the idea of microservices and moving stuff across, you know, on different servers and different IPs, we can share keys, and we can have web tokens that will work across a range of things, and so it's a really handy little way of getting information as part of your requests that are coming into your API to enable you to really quickly get you know, handle identities and stuff. You know, we can add OAuth 2, we can add whatever authentication layers and stuff that we want into this kind of thing, and pass back some of the stuff in our web tokens. We can add compression, and again, instead of writing a whole lot of compression, we can just do npm install compression. And again, it's a module for Express. We can stick that in. We can compress down all of our responses that come back from the server. So again, we're helping to deal with the idea of poor network performance and poor connectivity performance, because we're just making things as small as possible. And again, it's keeping it simple, and it's adding these layers in one at a time, because it allows us to test it, it allows us to make sure that they're all good. And because they're modular, we can add caching. We can add caching layers into them. And we can add all, you know, there is no limit to, excuse me. There's really no limit to what we can add. And we can go as deep down the rabbit hole as we want. Add documentation. Again, you've got things like API Blueprint. With Node, fantastic way of taking just a little bit of Markdown, running it through the API Blueprint. You've got a fully documented API at the end of it. And it's got a lot of built-in stuff for running calls, for testing stuff out. It's really well worth looking into API Blueprint. Add microservices. We've got the 1.0 release of Seneca the other day from the guys in Nearform. And as it so happens, what Seneca likes is it likes modularized services. And so again, if we take the idea that all of this has been modular and all of this has been modularized, then it makes it really easy to add the likes of Seneca in to wrap our various parts of our API. And then we can turn it into a fully microserviced environment and get all of the benefits that we have with that. Add whatever. And this is the core thing of it, is it's slightly changing the way we're thinking about putting together our APIs and putting together the information that we are sharing with the outside world. And we are being more flexible on the server. We're being good citizens on the server side almost. And we're saying whatever the client wants, we can react to and we can help them out. And if we're using Node, if we're using things like this, we can share a hell of a lot of code between ourselves. You know, we can add fully rendered templates in Node. You know, with the likes of Backbone Angular, we can pretty much run it on Node as well anyway. So we can serve websites in the full via Node. So the API can be as flexible as the client requires. Why should the front-end guys, and why should the client guys have all the fun with all the flexibility and with all the cool stuff? You know, we can do some flexible things. We can do some good stuff on the back end as well. And that's really the core that we want to take away, is just think a little bit more about how we can handle progressively enhancing the client experience from our server side. So we do not have to be particularly rigid and particularly heavy on this is the information you're getting. We can serve up whatever information a client might like, and we can be flexible that way. And so I've got a little GitHub repo up there, which shares some of the details and then has some of the code that you can run, and you can see the different ways. And so really it's just more about sparking a conversation and sparking the idea of let's make progressive APIs a bit more out there and a bit more of the way for people to think and to code. And we'll make the world happier for client developers, for server developers, and we'll all be happy. And that's all we want at the end of the day. And so, thank you. Are there any questions? Go first.
Okay, so you were talking about there about not having a singular API.
Yes.
Okay, so one of the things we're actually looking into that at the moment, which is that there would be an API per application, because the API would always have slightly different information. So what we're thinking of is that what would you consider, so where we're at the moment is trying to figure out how much code is shared between the front end app and the back end app, because a lot of the things are similar. So what would you recommend there in best practice in terms of JavaScript? Like, would you go with Browserify or other, is there anything you would use for, say, dependency injection, just to make that easier?
Start with the tough questions.
Sorry.
That's okay. To give the really wishy-washy answer, it depends. It's all down to the individual. I mean, a lot of it will depend on the stack that you currently have in place. You're going to tell me that we've got nothing in place yet, so that we're starting from the ground up. Things like Browserify are great. But really, if you have a good build system in place, you can go pretty much down whatever route you want. So what we use a lot of the time is we have Backbone-based, using Require.js for a lot of our client-side stuff. And we share a lot of code between the cloud side and the server side and the client side with that. And we use Grunt as a build tool. And so using Grunt, we can shift stuff around, and we can shift the templates and shift some of the common code and stuff around like that. We haven't done it in many cases, but you can run Backbone on the server as well. And so theoretically, you could get the server to serve everything, and the client would just be a standard client. So yeah, most of the options will work. It's probably just a case of looking at what your current stack looks like, and using either build tools or things like Browserify, or require is also useful as well in that case.
Thank you.
Yes?
Oh, take your time.
No, you can ask questions.
Yeah,
after
so
this.
the question I have is, you mentioned progressive APIs. What's your opinion about kind of complex APIs like GraphQL or frameworks like Falcor work in conjunction with responsive front ends at scale and display different UX based on the device?
They all have their place. I think this is just it's another way of looking at things. There are use cases where such where maybe my approaches work, maybe other approaches work better than other things. Again, it's that terrible thing if it all depends on the use case, but it really does. And yes, there are things to do that. I think maybe the slight difference between this approach is it does tend to keep things. It allows you to go from the simplest to the most complex, and so you're not tightly coupling you're not particularly tightly coupling your server side to your client, and some of the other approaches tend to couple you a little more tightly. And I suppose that's really the big difference. Is we're saying, the client can be anything, and whatever the client wants at that particular time, or whatever the client feels that it wants, or as we go into the next flavor of the month with a JavaScript framework next week. Or when Facebook go that we're fed up of rewriting the DOM in Canvas and want to rewrite the DOM somewhere else. With these kind of ideas, we can handle that straight away, and we just plug in another module on top, essentially, that serves it in a slightly different way. If XML makes a comeback, strange things have happened. I know I've said the dirty word in a Node thing, but we could spin up a SOAP site on this and serve an XML API if we've got somebody that wants to run that. And so it's really what it's about. It's that flexibility of being able to say, it doesn't matter what it is you're looking for. We can serve it. And we can serve it quite easily because we're just plugging in a module that serves things in a certain way. And so again, we could have a separate team who is an expert on an XML API doing that and testing that, and just plug it in and away we go. Go for it.
So is the idea that the client specifically asks for, so different clients ask for different things, or the back end reacts and then serves back depending on what it asks for?
I deliberately haven't specified that as part of this talk, mostly because that can be entirely dependent on how you want to work. So, for example, you could have it that you include a header with your requests that will specify that you want partials support, for example, and that you want your particular endpoint to return a partial. Or you could do it, the example I have on GitHub is simply different routes. And so you have your base API route, you have a partial route. So again, that's the kind of thing that it depends on what you want to do. And I suppose in an ideal world, if this was ever to take off, then it would be based on potentially capabilities that are exposed through the headers that are sent as part of a client. So you could do potentially some sniffing of individual headers and follow that way. But realistically, you're easier sticking to either just having differently named routes, which is straightforward enough for the clients to handle, or include in your header information, either in your JSON Web Tokens or as a separate header, the content type you're looking for. Or you could even do it via the content type sniffing. So if you have a request that's asking for HTML, then you could serve a partial on that particular request. If your request is asking for, if your request type is application JSON, then you return your JSON API.
So that's a brilliant point. It's just you're hinting at serving different branding or customizations based on the client or the principal in your token.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So you suggested to serve different content or different toolbars and so on based on the authorization or the identity in the token?
Yes, you could do. And again, the point is that it's up to you to make the decision whether that works with your way of working. And that, you know, if you're going to strictly enforce things on the API side, then that is a good way of doing it. Is by saying, you know, you've got a content accepts header on your API calls, and if you set that to be JSON, it'll return you JSON. If you set that to be XML, it'll return you XML. If you set that to be whatever. So that is one way of doing it. It's a useful way of doing it. But if you God, I'm going to use another bad word. SharePoint do that occasionally, except for some of the endpoints that don't. And then it gets really annoying because you just get in your head that if I request JSON in the content accepts, I get JSON back. Then you hit one endpoint and you say that and it returns the XML. Yay! Sorry, I've been integrating with SharePoint lately and it's a pain in the bum. Anyone else? Yes?
Yeah, just, as an API kind of matures and you go through different versions and might have to maintain version 1 and you allow access via root or via a header call. Have you got a preferred way of structuring your code, particularly modularly, that allows for multiple versions of similar code to kind of exist together?
In terms of having them modularly, you can essentially just have a different module for the different versions of your API.
Yeah.
So your JSON wrapper in the example here, you can have a version 2 or a version 3 of that. How you handle it from calling it from a device or from a client is, again, it's one of those questions like status codes, of which everyone you ask is going to have a different opinion. I quite like including a version in your root of your API. So you would have, foo.bar/API/v1 and whatever your root is. That tends to be the simplest and allows you to make massively breaking changes with v2 or whatever. And that would tend to be the approach that I would follow for that. But again, with things being modular, it's quite easy to sub in a module for a subsequent version or for a different version. And you just treat it as its own module, and it's got its own test, it's got its own everything. Anyone else, or are you all after the free pizza?
You were talking there about offline capabilities, so
Yes.
the fact that it's going to have some form of, let's say, offline storage or caching.
Yep.
Right? So in practice, when do you think it's necessary, like from the types of app, maybe that's a good way of categorizing it, where it makes sense to have it, and where other times, yes, it's nice, but you really don't need it?
Always go offline. Always, in my view. If something is important enough for somebody to want to view it on their device, might want to do it when they've no offline, when they're offline. It's not that difficult to do. There's a number of approaches, and so I would tend to say if you can build it in, build it in. At the very least, it is something that nobody notices and nobody shouts at you about. Or it's that 1 in 100 thing the user notices and goes, oh, hang on a minute, this is a lot smarter than I thought it was, or this is a lot better than I thought it was. And in that case, you've got a customer or a user or whatever for a long time because you've impressed them. And so, it's quite straightforward to do, and so I would go with doing it all the time if practical. Cool. Anyone else? Nope. Thank you very much. I'll be floating around all evening, so do feel free to come up and shout at me or ask questions or anything like that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you.